Hurry down to your local gas showroom and you'll find Blemish cookers from £239 fitted and great savings on fires. Plus, there's...
Foreign Minister, who, as we have said earlier, he was in talks with for some 6 hours, refused to accept his letter written by George Bush to Saddam Hussein. He said that Mr. Aziz demonstrated total inflexibility in the talks, that the talks, in brief, had failed. Now, he also said that he would welcome any other peace initiatives. Well, one of those initiatives has come from President Mitterrand, who's been talking tonight. We're joined now from Paris by Dominique Moisy of the French International Relations Institute. Dominique Moisy, could you tell us, please, Mr. Mitterrand did not spell out what his initiative represented tonight. What do you think his real aim is?
Well, tonight he was, so to speak, preparing the French for a possible war. In fact, he was in some ways reassuring the Americans that he was very close to them, that the alliance was not broken, was not shaken, that the French were strong. But at the same time, he said that if need be, he was not closing the possibility of launching a peace initiative with supposedly the support of the Americans. There was a vision of some kind of division of labor, which was expressed today by President Mitterrand.
Well, now, the Americans, at least in some quarters here in Geneva, have seen the division of labor, as you put it, as a division of alliance, that in some way President Mitterrand was putting a bit of a spanner into the works.
Yes, one can say that too. From a French perspective, all avenues for peace must be explored. And if the French can serve as some kind of go-between between the Arab world and the Western world, why not? But at the same time, we don't want it to appear as breaching the alliance.
But I thought the EC foreign ministers were trying to be the brokers between the Arab world and the United States.
Well, from a French point of view, the EC is fine, but if we can do something on our own, bringing maybe other Europeans behind us, the French believe that they have cards which other Europeans do not have. And sending a presidential envoy to Baghdad or another one to Algiers was a signal for the French that everything was explored.
Well,
of
now,
course, there's a risk.
What's the key to those cards, as you put it? I mean, are we talking about the post-pull-out period, the post-crisis resolution?
Yes, the French have put on the table positions which, in many ways, will be present in any future negotiation, with or without a war. There will be a negotiation of the Palestinian problem. There will be a discussion of all the regional problems which are at stake.
Well, now, you look at these things very carefully. You've been watching this 5.5-month crisis. What's your evaluation of whether the French really can make a major contribution in the 4 or 5 or 6 days left before the deadline?
I think it's quite unlikely. The French will make a difference only if the Iraqis are willing to make a major concession. It's not going to be the French who are going to make the difference. It may be they will contribute. They won't be the cause of it.
Well, Mr. Baker says that the Iraqis are totally inflexible. Briefly, what sort of flexibilities does the French think that exist in the Iraqi camp?
Well, Monsieur Vauzel, who spoke with President Saddam Hussein for 4 hours and a half, came back with the feeling that the Iraqis were, in fact, seriously aware of the danger of a war for Iraq, of the cost of war. Now, the problem is to know who is playing with whom. Are the Iraqis exploiting the French willingness to appear independent, or are the French reading into the Iraqis a little better than the rest of the West because they have had more dealings with Iraq than anyone else?
Dominique Moisy, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Paris. From Geneva here, that is it for the moment. There's a lot going on still. We'll bring it to you as soon as it happens. Now back to Nicholas Owen in London.
And some more of the day's news. Soviet troops have tonight taken up key positions in the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius. Thousands of demonstrators have gathered outside the Parliament building in response to calls to protect it. On Monday, the Kremlin sent troops into 7 Soviet republics to enforce draft laws. NATO is said to be very seriously concerned by the Soviet government's actions.
For thousands of the independence demonstrators now outside the Lithuanian parliament, it's a second night of vigil after yesterday's attempted mass break-in by their political opponents. Tonight, the threat is of military force, and the republic's president, Vytautas Landsbergis, called on all his people for support.
They are preparing for the attack against parliament.
Moscow's Interior Ministry says the troops now flooding into the Lithuanian capital are here only to enforce the draft laws. But parliamentary deputies say the armed threat to independence is evident.
This would be a pretext to start really a bloody suppression, use of force in a massive scale.
It's beginning to look very much like an attempt to destabilize the situation in the Baltics, and to that extent to provide a pretext for Moscow to intervene more directly in matters that really the Balts think should be theirs.
The Russian President Boris Yeltsin has warned that sending troops into the Baltic republics will only lead to violence. Condemnation by America and France was dismissed today by TASS as foreign interference. Troops are also heading for the Republic of Georgia, where deputies voted to defy an order from President Gorbachev to remove their own police from a territorial dispute in Ossetia. Members said any attempt to enforce Moscow's will would be an act of war.
Rebels in Somalia who are fighting to oust the government say epidemics of cholera and typhoid have broken out in the capital Mogadishu because bodies are decomposing in the streets. They say more than 1,500 people have died in 11 days of fighting. The president, Mohamed Siad Barre, today appealed for peace, according to the state radio station. Last week, one of the biggest rebel groups rejected calls for peace talks. Suspected Sikh militants have killed a group of 12 Hindus in the Punjab city of Ludhiana. Indian police say that Hindus were rounded up, taken to a railway station and shot. Sikh militants in Punjab are waging a campaign for an independent homeland. President Bush's son Neil was guilty of personal dishonesty, according to a report by American federal regulators. They accuse him of not fully disclosing his business ties when he was a director of the failed savings bank Silverado. And they say that before he's allowed to work at another savings bank, he'll have to show that he understands conflicts of interest. Neil Bush's lawyer has dismissed this as ludicrous. Here, the Education Secretary Kenneth Clarke has said reading standards must improve in Britain's schools following the publication of 2 reports today. One of them, by the school inspectors, showed that 1 in 5 7-year-olds couldn't read properly.
Right, difficult word. Should.
S-H-O-U. These children are among an estimated 20% who haven't yet mastered all the basics of reading. They're getting extra help, but the government, shocked by today's reports, says standards in many schools must improve.
Well, this isn't good enough. I think we know that standards of reading and spelling in our schools are not good enough. We can console ourselves with the thought that things are about the same as they were 10 years ago, but they've got to get very much better than this.
One reason singled out is the so-called real books method of teaching used here in Milton Keynes. It dispenses with formal set texts, but some teachers say it gives children a better appreciation of books.
One nurtures a love of books in children that they will take with them throughout life. They will become real readers.
Today's reports suggest clear policies and good management are more important than the method of teaching. Labour says the government itself has neglected to monitor standards.
20% of reading standards are unsatisfactory. That is a deplorable indictment of this government that has been running the education service for almost 12 years.
But for the first time, ministers have admitted that they do need to pay closer attention to how children learn to read.
Police say they believe more than 300 people were injured in the train crash at Cannon Street in London yesterday. 30 people are still in hospital, some awaiting operations for fractures, but none is in a critical condition. Police today named the man who died as Martin Strivens, a 24-year-old computer operator who lived in Kent. The Health Minister, Virginia Bottomley, has said government funding to the hospice movement is being doubled to £17 million. She said this was in recognition of the movement's vital role in caring for the terminally ill. Lord Chalfont, the chairman of the new radio authority, has announced that music will make up 3/4 of the output of the first national commercial radio station, which should start this year. Most of the music, he said, must be non-pop. The Conservative MP for Castle Point, Sir Bernard Brain, the longest-serving MP in the Commons, is standing down at the next election. Sir Bernard, who's 76, was first elected in 1950. 2 people died as heavy snow and gale-force winds swept the country. The snow was particularly heavy in the north of England and Northern Ireland. In Cumbria, snow blocked roads for most of the day and some areas were without electricity. The financial markets had taken some comfort from the fact that the talking between the Americans and the Iraqis lasted for a respectable time in Geneva. They closed, though, before Mr. Baker's statement that the talks had failed. The stock market index of 100 leading shares rose by nearly 30 on the day. On the currency markets, the pound rose by more than 2 cents against the dollar. Against a basket of currencies, the pound rose by 0.1. After the break, the latest from Geneva on the Gulf talks, and we'll be talking live to the former Prime Minister Edward Heath about today's developments. And reporting from the Swiss capital on the peace talks which, if nothing else, have gone on longer than anyone expected.
Very wise decision, sir. One lady owner. You obviously know a great deal about cars.
No.
No.
But I'm getting it inspected by a man who does.
Where exactly did you bury the car?
In the sand! I'm not helping much, am I, Dad?
No. But I know a man who can.
Can you fix it?
Not this time. I know a man who can.
Whatever your motoring problems, you'll find the answer is the AA. Join now on 0800 919595.
Your replacement car, ma'am.
This is a very nice car.
Well, he's a very nice man.
Very nice, man. Very, very, very nice.
The AA. We're all you need to know.
Learning the finer points of the Japanese tea ceremony is no tea party. If you don't get every detail just so, it's a no-no. That's when there's really nothing for it but to say sayonara, slip away, and relax with a malty, chocolatey Ovaltine Light. Enjoy a little light relief with Ovaltine Light.
These people all have sensitive teeth. It's a common problem, as your dentist will tell you. But she uses fresh-tasting Sensodyne F every day, because Sensodyne F's special ingredient quickly helps relieve pain. Now they all use Sensodyne F to relieve the pain of sensitive teeth.
Tiles, tiles, tiles. Now at the Tile Shop. We have over £1 million worth of ceramic tiles by leading manufacturers that must be sold. So we're practically giving them away. Tiles from only £3.99 per square yard. Yes, only £3.99 for a square yard. The Tile Shop. Branches at Bury, Blackburn, Altrincham, Warrington and Rochdale.
The main news so far, the Gulf crisis talks in Geneva ended in failure after 7 hours of talking. The US Secretary of State James Baker says Iraq showed no flexibility during the discussions. President Saddam said on Iraqi TV a few minutes ago, Americans would swim in their own blood if they attacked Iraq. President Bush, who's due live on US television in a few minutes' time, is said to be welcoming any other international initiative for peace ahead of the deadline for an Iraqi withdrawal next week. Well, now we go to Geneva and John Snow, who is there. John, tell me this, what is the mood, really? We hear so much about other initiatives and everything else, but is the general mood gloom, some hope, what?
Well, I think right now it is one of very considerable gloom. I have to say that during the day it really has ebbed and flowed, and in many ways it has risen as the talks lengthened. They certainly went on a lot longer than anyone expected, nearly 6 hours, and that is really a very substantially longer time than anyone expected. Mr. Baker's plane was supposed to have taken off at around 4 o'clock London time. He should have been in Turkey by now. He's still going to go to Turkey tonight. Mr. Tariq Aziz, the foreign minister, is about to speak to us, I think, within the next few minutes, but you can't predict anything with any certainty because he's obviously got to be talking to Baghdad before he does so. But certainly the picture here at the moment is one of gloom, but one should also couple that with saying that suddenly in the American camp there is some considerable relief that there's still somebody else to talk to the Iraqis, i.e. there are still the Algerians who are trying to launch an Arab initiative, and there are still the Europeans, and principally, of course, the French, who are very urgently trying to move in on the scene now.
There's not a suspicion then that the French are up to mischief. I mean, Mr. Gaffney in Washington used that word, didn't he? But will his view be widely shared?
Well, there is certainly that, and the real feeling here was that the French did exert a great deal of pressure on the Americans in the build-up to these talks by suggesting in some way that they had a formula that the Americans didn't have, and that if the Americans didn't stick at the table, suddenly the French would come in and offer an unacceptable solution. But then when President Mitterrand came on television tonight, as we saw earlier in the program, what he did was to endorse the UN resolutions to say that the Iraqis had to get out of Kuwait, that there could be no partial withdrawal. But where we think the French have got something going is what happens after the crisis is over. And I think they believe that some sort of guarantees can be given to the Iraqis to persuade them to leave. But as I say, there are still a large number of gaps here. And for one thing, until Mr. Aziz actually gets up and gives his side of the story, we're not really going to have the full picture from Geneva.
John, thanks very much indeed. If Mr. Aziz does, as you say, get up while we're still on air, we'll of course come straight back to you. But I'm joined in the studio now by the former Prime Minister Edward Heath, who of course went to Baghdad, talked to President Saddam, and then a lot of hostages came home, and everyone was very pleased about that. But there's very little to be pleased about tonight, Mr. Heath, is there?
Well, I think that the encouraging thing is that almost for the first time, Secretary of State Baker has said that he would welcome others also now using their influence with the Iraqis. I think this can be tremendously important, and especially if the Arabs can get together, the Arab countries and their representatives, and talk to President Saddam and also his ministers. Now, I think that is the first encouraging thing. The second thing was in Secretary Baker's press conference, in which he was asked, well, did they say they would refuse to withdraw from Iraq? And
from Kuwait.
From Kuwait. He said no, he did not say that. On the other hand, he didn't say that he would. Well, now, there is a diplomatic situation, if you like, there. And I think that can be very important as well. Now, a third thing, which was very interesting, because it's exactly what was said to me when I was in Baghdad by President Saddam himself. Secretary Baker said that, of course, he had said that they were threatened by Kuwait. Now, he said nobody in the world is going to believe that. The commentator who followed said, Secretary Baker said that they were militarily threatened by Kuwait. That wasn't what Baker had said. But what President Saddam has said, and Aziz to me also, is that they were economically threatened by Kuwait. Now, this is quite different, and that can be argued out in any discussion. And the argument is that Kuwait had quite deliberately extended the boundaries of Kuwait up towards Iran during the war, and as a result it got more oil, had siphoned it off, and therefore owed Iraq money for the oil, and that this was a payment which ought to be made. Now, that's, they also said, of course, that Kuwait was trying to force down the price of oil in order to weaken the Iraqi economy. Well, this is something which can be argued about in a discussion, or you can have an intermediary, or you can get the Arabs to settle it, or you can have the Secretary General of the United Nations, who was also suggested, dealing with that sort of thing. And that is part of the first resolution of the United Nations, 660, which is now never mentioned, and is absolutely fundamental. I brought it with me here. And the third part says, calls upon Iraq and Kuwait to begin immediately intensive negotiations for the resolution of their differences, and supports all efforts in this regard, and especially those of the League of Arab States. Now, this resolution demands that Iraq withdraw immediately and unconditionally, and calls upon Iraq and Kuwait to begin immediately intensive negotiations. Those two things, according to this resolution, should go together. And that, I think, is where the diplomacy has been lacking, and is still lacking.
You have been in favour of trying to see sanctions work, let the sanctions go on much longer, forget about January the 15th and so on. Is there any real evidence to your mind that sanctions are likely to make Saddam bend the knee?
I think that they are more likely than sanctions have ever been before to work on the government. And it'll take longer, of course. Nobody expected them to work in 4 months.
But we're talking about a country that endured 8 years of horrendous war against Iran, a country that is being called on to make sacrifices before.
Oh, yes, they were called upon to make sacrifices of personnel, but during those 8 years, they were supported by the whole of the Arab world. The Saudis supplied them with, what, nearly $20 billion worth of stuff. The Kuwaitis themselves say some 12 billion, the Emirates some 10 billion. And, of course, this is where I must say many people think that we in the West are hypocrites. Who supplied them with the armaments? The Soviet Union, the best aeroplanes they could produce. Who supplied them with the rest? The Americans, with the best equipment they could produce. We said we wouldn't supply arms after about 84, but we supplied them with other equipment. And now suddenly we say this man is the greatest evil in the world, and why doesn't he recognize all that's happening? Well, I think he does recognize all that's happening, but we've got to find a way out. This, I think, is when I differ from Secretary Baker in saying, no, there can be absolutely no question of saving face. We've got to be prepared in order not to have this ghastly war, to allow the man to save face.
Mr. Heath, thank you very much. We must leave it there. The main news again tonight. The Gulf crisis talks in Geneva ended in failure after 7 hours. James Baker, the American Secretary of State, said Iraq showed no flexibility. Mr. Baker did welcome any international peace initiative ahead of the Iraqi deadline for withdrawal. The British Prime Minister, Mr. Major, says he's very sad that President Saddam Hussein has not reversed his aggression. President Bush had this to say a few minutes ago.
I think Iraq has demonstrated no flexibility whatsoever, and I think the meeting we're having here today now takes on even greater importance because I would like to see the Congress send a strong signal that they want to see these United Nations resolutions fully supported, and given the position taken by Iraq at the Geneva meetings. Lasted several hours, the meetings did, but I've talked to the Secretary of State and I've told these friends in the United States Congress of his reaction, and his reaction was they were not flexible at all and showed no capacity to comply with the United Nations resolutions.
And that's Channel 4 News from London and Geneva. Good evening.
While the world's spotlight is on Iraq, its neighbour Iran has gone unreported. Once the hotbed of fundamentalism...
On BBC Two. Now we take our seats and embark on a film journey through the history of the movie musical. Everyone from Al Jolson to Barbra Streisand say, they gotta dance, they gotta sing.